In this video, I'm going to show you how to create simple animations using CSS transitions. And I'm going to be doing this in the context of an Ionic application, and there are different ways that you can go about animating things, but this is just a kind of really simple way to add some kind of cool effects to your application. And basically the idea is that you can change a CSS property from one thing to another, and we can animate that transition. So say in an Ionic application, for example, you might have something that has a certain style at some point, but then when something happens in the application, perhaps when you click some button, that style might change. So rather than just instantly applying that style change, we can set a property so that it transitions slowly. So you could have something that is, say it's going to go from being, it could go from having full opacity to being invisible. So rather than that just kind of flashing out of existence, we could have it so that it slowly fades away. And there's a lot of properties that you can do this with. Obviously opacity is one of them, it's listed right here. So this is a list of all of the properties we can use. You can't animate every single property, but there are a lot that we can use, and they can add some really nice little effects to the application. So what I'm going to do is just go through a really quick example of how you can use a transition to animate one of these properties. So I've already generated an application, and we're going to jump into that now. And so what I'm going to do is just come into the home page here, and I'm going to create a button, and then when we click on that button, we're going to change its style in some way, and we're going to animate that. So I'm going to create that button in here. Now we'll just create a normal button. We'll give it the primary theme, and we're just going to add a click event binding to that, and we're just going to call a function called change style. And we'll just say click me on that button. And we're also going to set up some default styles for that button. So we'll do that in here. So as I mentioned before, we could animate the opacity. So if I set this to just opacity 1, of course, nothing really is going to happen, because that just means that it is fully opaque, and we're going to be able to see that. But let's just take a look at what we have in the browser now. And of course we have an error. I've got some syntax error in here. Oh, I missed the closing bracket. Okay. So we have our button here, it just says click me, we can click it, and it calls a function that doesn't exist. So now we're going to implement this function, and we're going to make that change this button style. So that we're actually able to grab this button easily, I'm going to add a template variable to this, and we'll just call it my button. And that's going to allow us to grab a reference to that in here. So we can use viewChild to do that. And I'll just set up a member variable here for that by using the viewChild decorator there. Now we just need to supply the name of the variable we created, which was my button. And then we'll just name my button as well. So that's going to allow us to reference that as this.my button throughout this class. Okay, so now we're going to define that function that we added here. So change style. And inside of this is where we're going to modify the style of that button. And to do that, we're going to use something called a renderer. And that's going to allow us to modify that style. I've talked a little more in depth about what the renderer is exactly in other videos, so I'll probably just link to one of those if you're interested in learning what that's all about. So now in this change style function, we can use the renderer by calling this. Actually, we need to import the renderer from the Angular library. And then we can just do this.renderer.setElementStyle. And then we just need to supply the element itself. So we're changing my button. So we need to do this.my button, and we need to supply the native element from that, which is the actual DOM element. Then we just say the style that we want to change, which is going to be opacity. And we're going to set that to, we'll set it to 0 because we want it to disappear. So hopefully when we click this now, that's going to just make the button disappear instantly. So if I click on this now, oops, I've got some kind of error. Okay, so let's just check if I'm not doing anything silly here. We'll check if this .my button is actually being grabbed correctly. Oh, we actually, yeah, so the button's getting grabbed correctly, but we actually need to grab this element reference, which contains the native element. So we can do that with this little, it's kind of additional functionality of this view child here. But what we can do is import element ref, and then we can say we want to read that property. So by doing that, that should instead return us that element reference directly. Now, hopefully I've got the syntax for that correct. Yeah, so now you can see we're just getting the element reference there, and then we have direct access to that native element. And so as I click that, you would have also seen on the actual app here that the button did disappear. And so I'll do that again. Obviously, it's working, but that's not a super awesome effect, I guess. It just kind of disappears and that's it. So what we can do is set that transition property I was talking about. So if I come back into this button here and I specify the transition property, I can define how I want that transition to animate. So I could animate that over, say, 2 seconds by writing 2s. And then you can also supply the type of animation you want to use. So I could use linear, which is just kind of a straightforward animation. But there's lots of different types like ease in, ease out, ease in, out, that kind of do things like the animation will be faster at the beginning and then slow down towards the end, or it'll be slow at the beginning but then speed up towards the end. So let's just see what that looks like. So if I click on this now, that didn't actually look like it applied. I might not have that CSS applying correctly to that button. Let me just check. So I'll just refresh that there, and then we'll take a look at this and see if we've got our opacity 1 defined on here somewhere. Yeah, so we've got the opacity is defined here. We are getting our styles applied, but it looks like our transition property is actually being overwritten somewhere else. So perhaps Ionic by default, and they do actually. They've got the transition property already set to 100 milliseconds. So they already have that animation defined for us. So if we overwrite their transition with our own of 2 seconds, that's just going to make that transition take longer. So I'm just going to add important to this property so that it'll overwrite Ionic's own transition property there. And we'll give that a refresh and we'll have a go again. So if I click that now, you can see that it slowly fades out over 2 seconds rather than using the default 100 milliseconds that Ionic had defined. If Ionic didn't have their own styling already set up, then it would have just instantly gone. Okay, so that's one transition we can do, but we can do more than just the opacity. So let's go back to that list of animated properties we have in here, and we could do that with any of these. So let's say we want to animate the padding. So let's say we start off with a padding of 10 pixels on the button here. And I'm just going to, I usually do this to make my CSS rules more specific, because sometimes you do run into that situation where Ionic styling overwrites your own. So by making ours more specific, by putting them inside of these iOS and Android tags, it just decreases the likelihood that ours are going to get overwritten. So we've got 10 pixels by default now. So if we take a look at this, that's what it looks like with 10 pixels of padding. We've still got that transition of 2 seconds set. So if we change this padding, that's going to animate that over 2 seconds. So if I was to come in here now and instead change the padding to, let's say, 50 pixels. If I click on this now, you can see that it slowly grows out to 50 pixels of padding. And so let's just take a look at that that transition property here. As I mentioned, you can set this to other things besides linear. So if I click on this, you can see that's a sort of straight line. It's just a linear animation, but we can also use different types. So this one's ease out, and you can kind of see as I switch between these, if you watch the circle at the top, you can see how it affects the animation. So this one in particular, I think is really easy to see what's going on this next animation. It kind of does this weird quick, then it goes back, and then it finishes off. So that was called, well, they have the animation listed here as out back, but it's kind of a manually defined cubic Bezier animation. So you can even do really complicated looking animations like this. So let's see what that looks like if we just replace our own transition with this cubic transition here. We can take a look at what that would look like. So if we click on this now, it does this sort of weird thing where it grows and then it shrinks and it goes back again. It's a bit of a weird animation, I think, to do it on padding. So I'm going to go back to opacity. Set that back to 1, and we'll make it a bit quicker too, because 2 seconds is quite long. And then I'll just modify this back to opacity again. So if I click this now, that will animate based on that new transition we have set up. And just for fun, let's try one more animation. Let's go with one that's going to affect the position. So we can modify, say they've got like the right, and there should be a top property in here somewhere. There it is. So we can also affect the position of the element, and we can animate that. So if I was to go into here again, and let's change that to, we'll give it a position of, we'll use a relative position. And so we're going to start this out, we'll start it out 50 pixels from where it usually would be. This is relative to its normal position. So this is going to be 50 pixels from the top from its normal position. And then in here, if we change this to 0, that's going to bring it back to its normal position. So we'll give this another go and we'll see what that looks like. So as you can see now, that click me button it's down a bit further than it was before. And if I click this now, it just kind of pops back into where it should have been. And you can see that sort of that cubic Bezier animation taking effect there. It kind of goes up and then it springs down a little bit and then it settles. And I think that the effect's a bit more easily seen with this sort of position animation rather than opacity or the weird padding animation we did. So you can animate any of these with that same sort of CSS transition property, and it's an easy way to make it feel a little bit more interactive and polished without having to get into doing really complex animations. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.